Turn with me to Revelation chapter 12. Now, what we must remember as we enter into chapter 12 is this. Chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 all deal with the seventh trumpet. All deal with the seventh trumpet. The trumpet blows. Christ returns during his time frame. The dead in Christ are raised. All of these things happen, and it is the summation of human events. Because from that time forward, God will reign. It will be his kingdom. The kingdoms of man stop with the seventh trumpet. The activities of man stop. And we went through last week we kind of summarized what happens in chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, just to see the panorama of the seventh trumpet. Okay? Here in chapter 12, the concentration is upon the believers of God. Believers of God. It's going to be represented by a woman. Okay? A woman with clothing that's like the sun. The radiance of the moon even under her feet. Right? She's got 12 stars in a crown. It's just a magnificent, beautiful picture of this woman. She is contrasted in the Bible between, again in these same chapters, between the woman in chapter 17 who is the whore of Babylon. Last time we talked about chapter 12 as we were doing this summary and ending up chapter 11 and the blowing of the actual trumpet, we talked about this being the church of God. That's what the woman is. She represents the believers in God. So let's first of all look at her. Verses 1 and 2. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried and travailed in birth and pained to be delivered. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. Right? There are different interpretations by different folks as to exactly who and what this woman is. Some think that she's the nation of Israel alone. Okay? Some think that it's Mary. Right? And some who are right, like me, think it's the New Testament church, or actually the church in general, the believers of God in general. And there's problems with each of these interpretations when you take them out to their extreme. Because it definitely represents, in a way, believers throughout all centuries. Okay? Because we have the belief community, in essence, the community of belief, bringing forth a child, and that child is clearly Christ in this text. Okay? So the New Testament church didn't start until the child was here. So it can't just represent only the New Testament church. Or it might in some aspects. We'll get into that a little bit later. But mainly, the reason that would keep it from being just the Jewish nation, for example, is also clear, because this woman is talked about throughout all ages, past the time of the Old Testament dispensation, up into the time of those 3.5 years at the end of time for the wrath of God. So this woman represents the believers in all ages, especially in the New Testament period, because her she's spoken about throughout all ages here in this chapter. It's talking about her being at labor with a child. All right, now what we're going to see in these first 6 verses, along with the first 2 we've just looked at, is we're going to see the birth of this child of promise. And then as we get a little further into the chapter, what we're going to see is we're going to see the devil and Satan thrown out of heaven, cast out. And then as we get to the latter part of this chapter, we're going to see that this Satan is angry with the remnant of God, with the people of God, and he's going to make war with the saints because he's been thrown out of heaven. That's kind of the whole chapter in a summation. But we've been looking at the woman here. Let's think about, again, verse 2, that child. There is, in verse 2 it says, and she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. The focus in this verse is the child, yes, but it's also the pain and travail of childbirth, of this childbirth. Right? Let's think about that. Romans chapter 8, if you will, for a moment, please. I'm going to stick my finger over here in Revelation because we're certainly coming back, and we're not going to stay long in Romans. But Romans chapter 8 expresses a similar idea. Down in verse 21. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from bondage and corruption in the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Until now. Our whole creation groaneth and travail in birth pains for the return of Jesus Christ. Okay? For the redemption of all of creation. And in essence, this woman being pregnant with this child in Revelation represents that same groaning and travailing for the redemption of all mankind. Where are we in the book of Revelation? We're at the very end. In essence, we as a church, we as the people of God, we as the world, all are groaning and travailing for what? The return of Christ and the redemption of all things. So this child is coming forth at the time of travail and groaning. So it may not speak so much of the first coming of Christ, of the physical birth of Christ, but it may also point to the return of Christ and the fact that the whole creation, especially the church, in this time, which is going to be persecuted horribly, is looking forward to the birth of rebirth of Christ, the return of Christ to our earth. So we've got this whole story about this woman and her child, and she's got 12 crowns on her head, or she got a crown with 12 stars on her head, and that story with the moon and the sun and the 12 stars reminds me a lot of Joseph in, I think it's chapter 38 of Genesis, about verse 37 or so, where he has a vision. And in that vision, he has 2 visions. This is the second one. That his father and mother compared to the sun and the moon. And his 11 brothers, are compared to stars. Now there's a lot of differences between that story and this one. But we can think about the church especially during the time of John and as time came along, there was this woman, the church, and essentially it had the 12 apostles at its head. And these 12 apostles might represent those 12 stars. And they would come back, and what does it say they're going to do in the redemption of mankind? When asked for how they were arguing with Christ, or they were arguing among each other, and Christ answered the question when they were asking about who would be greatest in the kingdom and so on and so forth. And he talked to them about don't be like these Gentile rulers who seek to have someone lord over you. And Christ was telling them about that those 12, one being replaced now, Matthias in Acts. He said, you 12 will rule over what? The 12 tribes of Israel. And so they could be representations on this cloud. So we got a lot of things that are going on here, but the basic idea is this is the New Testament church. And the child is Christ. So let's look at verse 3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, there was a great wonder in verse 1. Verse 3, there's another wonder in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, and to devour her children as soon as she was born. Now, people will take this red dragon, thrown out of heaven by Michael the archangel, and him sweeping his tail across the heavens and removing 1/3 of the stars, and tie them to Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. I don't know the technical tie between those verses. I know that it is a common practice to interpret that as such. What we do know for sure is this red dragon is Satan the devil, because it calls him that here in this area. So Satan is pictured as a red dragon. Now we start to getting into those chapters in Revelation which talk about beasts and horns and crowns and all of these things. But this beast is clearly called the devil here, and he's pictured with the 7 horns and the crown, 7 crowns and the 10 horns, or 7 horns and 10 crowns, or whatever it is here. Let's take a look. Let's make sure I get it right. 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. There we go, 7 crowns. So I'm not going to take a deep prophetical representation here of this beast and try and tie it to physical countries at this point, because here it clearly points to the devil. Now, what does it point to? It points to his power in this case. Now, when we get into the beast later, those will have to do with the same things that Daniel had to do with in his beast, and they will represent governmental entities, etc. But here, I want to take it away from that. I want you to think about what that beast here, the one that is clearly the dragon, is clearly the devil, represents. In one place, the devil is called the prince of the power of the air. Anybody remember that scripture? All right, and he is also called the god of this world. So this dragon really represents that political power, that influence that Satan has over the world through its governments, and also the ecclesiastical power that Satan has over much of the world's religious ideas. He influences them. He is the prince of the power of the air. He is the God of this world. He is this horrible, ugly-looking creature called a dragon, having lots of power and lots of fury. And during his fury of being cast out of heaven, he sweeps a third of the stars from heaven. Now we know he does have demons. So I don't disagree that these are demons that it's talking about. The third of the angels that it's speaking about being swallowed in heaven. I'm just saying that I don't know that there's a technical tie between this and Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. What the real picture here, though, is of Satan, our deceiver, our accuser, being cast from heaven to the earth. And, if we were to go back to the book of Job, we would find that Satan would be in heaven and he would be accusing Job before God. Remember that? And God would say, have you considered my servant? And then Satan would say, well, just take everything from him and he'll curse you. That's what Satan does. That is what he does all the time. He accuses the brethren. He is in our opposition. And what happens here in this chapter is this accuser of the brethren is cast from heaven, and he's angry as a result. He's angry as a result. Let's look a little further. And he drew, and his tail drew a third part of the stars from heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour the child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God, and lo, to his throne. Now, earlier in the sermon I told you that this child was Christ, and this is the verse I based that on. Christ is to rule the earth, rule the people in the kingdom with a rod of iron. It's clearly pointing to Christ. All right? And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now, we've seen that number before. Okay? It represents 3.5 years. You take 1,260 days, using the lunar calendar, and guess what? You're going to come up with 3.5 years. And we saw that in the phrase time, times and a half time. We saw that earlier in the book as 1,260 days. We saw it as 42 months. And all of those add up to that 3.5 year period. So here we have the woman at the very end of time. We have the devil, we have the child, and we're going to see the offspring of the woman. And it's during this 3.5 year period, at least, that the severity of the destructiveness of the dragon is seen to its fullest extent. Okay? Seen to its fullest extent. So we got this period of 3.5 years. All right. And there was a war in heaven. All right, there's a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. Their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out. That old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world, he was cast out onto the earth, and his angels were cast with him. As I noted before, we have the dragon, and he sweeps the tail, and a third of the stars of heaven fall. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come the salvation and the strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of the brethren is cast down, which accused them before God day and night. We talked about the fact that Job is an example of him being the accuser. He's cast down, he and his angels, cast down to the earth, and so he is very, very angry. Very, very angry. All right? And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. All right. This pictures the people of God who stood and who stand in opposition to Satan. He is our accuser. He is the deceiver. He is our enemy. And he is being fought. And people overcome him by the blood of the Lamb. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe it is to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth he has but a short time. So again, this is the end time. This prophecy scans from before the child was born until now, at this point, during that 3.5-year period. And when the dragon saw that he was cast to earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child, and the woman were given 2 wings, and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and a half time, from the face of the serpent. Now, there's a lot of interpretations of this. I could probably delve into them if we wanted to. I don't think we will. But there are some who believe there's this. I don't know if you ever saw the Indiana Jones movies, but the last one, called The Last Crusade, they go through a little narrow valley, and they find this city carved out of the face of a mountain. Okay? Carved out of the face of the mountain in this hidden valley. And that city actually exists in Jordan. Okay? So there's a lot of people, at least in my past, I know, that believe that they were going to be carried away to a place of safety. And that place of safety is going to be that little hole in the rock there of that narrow valley. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. But here's the point. God can protect his people wherever they are. Right? Remember who are the intended readers of this book, at least besides us. It was the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Right? And the 7 churches in Asia Minor were going under great persecution. And I've mentioned this before during our time in the book of Revelation. They were going under great persecution. The church was being scattered throughout all of the Roman Empire. Right? It's being scattered. The Jewish people were being scattered from the Holy Land as well. They were taken away from the Holy Land and they ended up along the Black Sea and all other places. Right? They were being scattered. These people were concerned because they could see their friends being dragged out in the streets and killed and murdered. And what this passage does is what a lot of passages in the book of Revelation do. It gives hope to the helpless. Hope to the helpless. God is going to protect His people even during this 3.5-year period of wrath and destruction. They're taken away for 3.5 years. They're protected in the wilderness. I'm thinking God can protect me right here in Fort Worth. Now, if He tells me to get on a bus or a plane and go somewhere, I will. But if that happens, and it happens during my lifetime, He can protect me here in Fort Worth or Little Rock or even Salt Lake City, Utah, if I happen to live there. God can protect me where I am. And that should give me great comfort. God can protect His church no matter where it is. Remember. So God protects His church for this time and a half time. And even though there is wrath and destruction around them. And the serpent cast out of his mouth, water as a flood after the woman, that it might cause her to be carried away in the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. We're in that third part of the chapter which I talked about, which was the wrath of Satan upon the church. We see an increase in the world of hate speech against the church of God, the people of God. The thing I hate so much about this prediction of May 21st as the return of Christ is it gives the world another excuse to make fun of and ridicule the actual church of God. Right? Well, see, there's another prophet. He's failed. He's just these Christians, they're all dingy. They just believe God's coming back, and every time they're disappointed. I saw a person who I know, who's an atheist, making fun of the 21st of May prediction on Facebook. Of course, I saw a lot of Christian friends making fun of it too. Okay? But this atheist person wasn't because she believed God was going to return at all. It's because she didn't believe, and it gave her another excuse not to believe. See, this is what Christians believe. So I see a rise in this distrust of the Christian church. There is a rise of this ridicule of the Christian church. The Christian church seems to be in the way, to a certain extent, of governmental policies or cultural policies we'd like to put into place. It'd just be better off if the Christians weren't around. That's kind of the idea. Of course, here in America, we still have 51, we still have a great number of people who claim to be Christians, and even evangelical Christians. So we live in a little bit of a cocoon. Once you go outside the United States, even in those nations that have been Christian in the past, secularism has taken over. and in a lot of those countries. And in essence, the Christian church has already been vanquished in a lot of those countries. It may not be completely persecuted yet, but the time will come. The time will come. And that's what this speaks of. When it talks about a flood or waters, usually it's talking about peoples. And so in essence, what the Scripture is saying here is that Satan is going to flood the earth with non-Christians seeking to destroy the people of the church. That's going to happen. Hadn't happened yet. That's going to happen. And we can see the possibility of that happening just by the cultural nature of what's going on in the world. It's building up to where that could happen, where people could just hate Christians, that they could just make fun of Christians, they could discount Christians, they could put them in prison for what they believe. It's not an unreal thought. Now, back in the 50s and early 60s, I don't think you could have thought that and really meant it. For that time, there really wasn't the seeds of the idea that religious people would become, religious Christians at least, would become a minority. Now, I think you can say that. And I think it's a minority that can be hated and distrusted and persecuted. And remember, we are in the context, last of all, we are in the context of the very end of time. The woman, the stars, the dragon, his war with the saints is all pictured within that snapshot, that panoramic view of that seventh trumpet, the return of Christ, the very end of the age. The very end of time. In verse 17 it says, "And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." Remember that thing we read in Ecclesiastes when we started our worship services? What's the whole duty of man? Fear God and keep His commandments. These people do exactly that. These people keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. These are the people that Satan really, really, really doesn't like. This is a summation of the history from before the birth of Christ, throughout Christ's life, throughout the period of the tribulation, and especially up to that 3.5-year period. John, or actually God through John, is showing a picture of the history of the church up to the very end, because at this point in the Scripture, we are at the very end. He's summing it up. He's tying up one of those loose ends of the story thread like we talked about last week. All right, what can we take from this? In summary, everybody likes it when I say that. In summary, what are we talking about here? Well, we've got a woman with 12 stars on her head, clothed in white raiment, so white it's bright, represents her righteousness, her goodness, her virtue. She is compared to that unvirtuous woman, that unholy woman in chapter 17. She represents the believers of God throughout all ages, but specifically in the New Testament time, the New Testament church. Because in that very end, when we get down to the end, it's the New Testament church that she makes war with. Right? that Satan makes war with. What we can take away from this passage is this. Jesus Christ is coming back. We know that, right? Now, he didn't come back on May 21st. This isn't a great disappointment. Okay? We don't need to go off and predict when he's going to come back again. He comes as a thief in the night. You know, all of those things we know. But he is coming back. And that's what I wrote to say to this friend of mine back, because they were making fun of the fact that it didn't happen on the 21st. I said, just because it doesn't happen on the 21st doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that the person who predicted it was wrong. There have been people who've been wrong before. But that doesn't change the fact that Christ is coming back. And when he comes back, and until he comes back, he will protect his people. We can take comfort in these words. It doesn't matter what time or age we live in, God is with his people. And we need to be remembering that. I think the last thing we can really take from this passage is this. What is the characteristic of those people at that time that are protected? They keep the commandments of God, and they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ were standing up in front of you here today, he would tell you that the greatest thing you can do to be within that number of people who are protected throughout the centuries and well within the will of God is that you be people who are keeping the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. We should be about that mission and goal. Even more so as we see the days approaching, the Scriptures say. All right. Take comfort in protection and make your life today. Make your life today like those people that are protected throughout the ages by